which is a bizarre way of education. But that can lead to this other idea, which is the way of education nowadays is or what we hear anyways, is an attempt to remove any source of trauma, any source of anything that would be contrary to the child's desire at any moment. Like there's a tendency towards that kind of education. And I'm wondering what either of you has to say.
To make their educational environment very safe, you mean?
Not only safe, but to remove any...
Even optimal frustration.
Yeah.
We produce all these highly entitled people
that's my
who
question.
have no concept. I mean, I have a lot of families that come to me with kids who are completely out of control. I say, your kid is really healthy, but what you're doing to him, like, you know, giving him no limits whatsoever, like no, I mean, you need a little bit of frustration for growth, right? And it goes back to this kind of idea, this kind of fantasy, that if you allow the child to do whatever they want, you'll foster the creative genius. Let me tell you, you produce a monster.
But are they monsters or the creative genius?
Not really. I shouldn't use that word. You know, I'm not saying that it would happen to all children, because most children seek out normality. Right? And their peer group balances them, and thank goodness your parents aren't the only people who shape your experience. Your teacher will frustrate you, other people will. But you're right, it's an interesting thing philosophically. When are you ready for that kind of, we will give you no impediment. You can have whatever you want right now, this minute.
No, don't worry about it.
It's scary.
Did you want to say something, Michael?
Yes, please.
Of course, there's so many things to say, but I just, I was very interested. I haven't read the book, but I was very interested in what you were saying, and I think this may tie to this particular point that has been brought up now. It's this idea of constraint that you talked about earlier. There was constraint. When you talked about Elgar, that he actually, in fact, even put himself, or they, in fact, the others too, put themselves in situations where there was that constraint. And I think we think of genius. So you used the term trauma, but I think you went back to something. You said it's constraint. It's the constraint element that is necessary to introduce some sort of balance. That this creative power is not just freedom unleashed, but it needs also elements of constraint. It's a very complicated process. I mean, there's no solution, and we don't know how to do it in whichever way. But I was also struck by sort of the language that we use to describe these things and how it's inscribed culturally. And something came to my mind is when the word inspiration came. And that is when in the Renaissance, when Plato wrote a lot about mania, actually, madness, and good madness and bad madness, and that sort of thing. But when it was translated, his work was translated by McGill in the Renaissance. That is when inspiration came into our language, and meaning where madness was being seen as the person being inhabited by the Spirit, or by God, of course, becoming, in other words, God themselves. When actually in the early time, this good madness was seen as a connection with the divine, but the divine being outside of us. So it's an openness to the divine that is outside of us, not the divine all of a sudden inhabiting us and making us as ourselves as gods, so to speak. So I think this idea of constraint and inspiration it's very complicated.
It's very complex, and it's also very culturally embedded. We talk about Majnun, for example,
yes,
in Persia.
What did you say, Dr.
Majnun,
which is Arabic.
Majnun, yeah.
The madness of love. There's a couple who goes into the desert looking for his love, and there's this paradigm that love can drive you mad, and that love is inspired by the divine, and that, or the Sufis would say, it is because you will never have access to the divine that you will be inspired to become mad with love. And Rumi talks about this. So every culture has its own formation around madness and genius and inspiration, and it's very culturally embedded.
Yeah.
I really agree with you.
Okay, that's.
And how do we use the word means something completely different to every person in this room because of whatever their cultural embedding is.
Here's another comment regarding your books, and the section dealing with Robert Schumann, an excerpt from one of the Temperate Roads. I found myself gravitating to the sentence, quote, "As children always carry the burden of their parents' expectations, perhaps Frau Schumann's death even fueled Clara's determination of responsibility to be with Robert," end of quote. Clara's father also expected much of his daughter. He expected her to live her life not as she chose, but as he chose. I asked myself, do expectations keep us from becoming true to ourselves? Do expectations prevent us from knowing the truth? Do expectations become our challenge and help us grow? Can a mental or emotional illness be the result of unfulfilled expectations? How would you respond, Dr. Guzder?
Well, I think they're all wonderful questions. I don't think there's an answer for them. Because maybe all of those things are involved in how we think through that. That is, don't you think? Because we are burdened by our parents. Because we ingest our parents. So if our parents have an illness, as it were, I'm using the word illness very loosely here, an unanalyzed part of themselves that they're projecting into that child, there comes a time when, as we grow up, we de-idealize our parents. Some sooner than others. And we have to digest our love for them with respect to these things which are projected, these things which burden us. And we may love our parents even more because we may understand where that comes from, and how historically, or how, and be able to, for it to expand, and we may not forgive them. There could be any number of individual scenarios with these. So I like the fact that the person who wrote that saw it as a series of questions, not as a series of answers.
And Schumann and Clara responded very differently to Herr Wieck than they did to Frau Schumann, because of course Wieck became a monster by the end and impossible and every kind of impediment to their happiness. So I think in the end, especially when he was speaking ill against his own daughter Clara and setting up this Pleyel girl to then take over the world, pianistic world, Clara saw the light, and I think she was willing at that point to turn her back on her own father, which I'm sure was very difficult to do. But there was something about that moment when Frau Schumann met Clara as just a child magi, as I said, as a 13-year-old, before she would have had any real sexual appeal for Robert. And
Ask Celine Dion about that.
Well, this is 150 years ago. I don't know. Maybe they were a little bit more innocent. I'm not sure, but anyway. And she bestowed Clara with, she said, you will marry my Robert, and
I'll give a blessing.
And yes, it was the blessing and the coronation of that. And I think they both looked to that as something much more magical, more innocent, more positive, and more sort of an occult sort of, something they could work with in their lives that enhanced their marriage and their getting together, rather than this old, horrible man that just had to be cast off and cast off and cast off time after time after time. So.
Where was her mother in that story?
Clara's mother? Well, she had divorced from Wieck, of course, and she enters into it just very briefly as near the time when all the stuff is happening in the courts, and Clara can no longer travel with her father.
Alone in the bedroom.
She has to travel with someone, so she travels a bit with her own mother. She reconciles a bit with her mother, spends some time with her own mother.
So she's desperate to find somebody who will divide her from this father, who owns her and hijacks her life.
Yes, yeah, of course.
And he should be somebody that the father hates, because otherwise she won't have any
Right.
separation.
Right.
I remember vividly meeting some people studying Quebec history and what it was like before the Quiet Revolution. But some women saying that they wanted to get married because it was their salvation from the family.
Wow.
And they saw the husband as the Messiah
Oh my goodness.
to rescue them from what they had to live in pre-Quiet Revolution Quebec.
And sometimes it was out of the fire and into the fire.
Yeah.
We're down to our last 5 minutes, folks, and there's several people who have not asked questions yet. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Yes, Ms.
I
Valiquette.
just want to add to what you just said, is that many women also went into religion for the same reason, to have a career and not having to bear 12 children, and wanted to have a different kind of life to themselves.
That's actually, Ms. Valiquette, an excellent point. There's a book written, Taking the Veil, and it's on the religious origins of feminism in Quebec. We saw the nuns as oppressed. Where else could you become the CEO of an entire hospital? Where else could you travel the world as a missionary? Where else could you be an artist and teach the arts and have that as your sole purview to which you were only responsible? And they gave new meaning to the expression Mother Superior. And it's a book by Dialogic. It's a Taking the Veil. And we often, in our post-Quiet Revolution reaction to Quebec before, we see it as throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I've met some of these ladies. You can meet them, l'hôpital des hospitalières. And these are, you meet these ladies who are now, some of them are in their 80s, and they talk about the wonderful experiences they would never have had. For example, when the genocide happened in Rwanda, many of these ladies were the frontline troops to take care of the orphan children. They were able to do things that they could not have even imagined otherwise.
Pick up and go.
Other questions, comments, observations? Well, now remember.
I have one little tiny.
Yes,
one
go.
little small short question.
Yes.
So I have a question of you, Dr. Guzder. Do you know? I've often wondered this. I noted in my book, and I said for the time being, this will have to remain for me a question and a comment. I don't know if you caught it, but in your experience, I noticed all 4 of my subjects changed, noticeably and dramatically around the age of 9 and 10. And I wonder, is that something that is typical of adolescent development, or is this something that could foreshadow a complicated, the sort of seed, where you can see the seeds of a very complicated young adult personality forming? Or do you notice anything? Is there literature about the child at around the age of 9 or 10 is a kind of like
The age you chose your cello.
Yeah,
That's right.
Well, it's around 8 or 9 that we actually understand deeply what death is. That we actually, the child actually recognizes that it is irretrievable. The object is irretrievable.
Okay.
And there's some play back and forth before that. If I jump out of a window, I can resurrect myself, or it's still a fantasy. By 4, you kind of form a person, but you have no concept really of what death is. But by 8 or 9, you do. So there is a kind of individuation moment.
Okay.
Okay. So
That's interesting.
there is a kind of a turning in the world, a sobering, I would call it. And you don't have abstract thinking yet. Abstract thinking comes a little bit later. So you're naive and you're concrete, but you have this realization emotional.
Okay, and it does sober one up. It makes the child thoughtful, troubled. I did.
2 things to announce.
I did.
If you haven't seen our treasure, please see Fleetwood. But we invite you to see the exhibition of Dr. Jaswant Guzder. Here's the address. I asked Ms. Kaderavek to bring her CDs. We have been studying them and having had quite a journey. If you would like to get a CD of Ms. Kaderavek, And we would like to thank on behalf of the Temperance and our guests today for making the well-tempered imagination possible, Ms. Karen Kaderavek, Dr. Jaswant Guzder.